Well, thanks for coming tonight. I am Robert Wright. I'm a visiting professor of science and religion here at Union Theological Seminary. Those of you who were here when I spoke last week know that my mission here at Union is to develop and articulate a worldview that is spiritual, but is totally compatible with science and even informed by science. So it's a worldview that doesn't depend on any claims of special revelation, or doesn't appeal to scriptural authority. It's a worldview, that you don't have to take on faith. In principle, I can argue for it, and that's what I'm doing in the course of these 5 talks, of which this is the second. I'm kind of laying out elements of my worldview and arguing for them. Now, when I say that I'm developing this worldview, that's a little bit misleading, because actually I've kind of had this worldview for a while. I mean, it's been my de facto worldview, but I've never really put it together and tried to kind of argue that it's a coherent package or that it makes any sense. And I don't really know if it does make any sense to anyone else, and that's one reason I welcome the kind of feedback that I get in the question and answer sessions after these things. And tonight, we actually have 2 rounds of feedback. We have a special guest, Paul Bloom, well-known psychologist at Yale and public intellectual. He's been kind enough to come down from New Haven and will be unkind enough to ask me witheringly challenging questions after my talk, before the Q&A. Now, spiritual worldviews can have a lot of elements. There are a lot of elements that are more or less typical. They tend to provide some source of inspiration, hope, consolation, moral orientation. Often a spiritual worldview will have a kind of a cosmic narrative. You know, they will situate the human experience in a kind of sweeping vision of history that may help orient the person morally, or may even infuse them with a sense of purpose. And these kinds of elements and others I will be talking about in the coming talks, but tonight I'm going to focus on another thing that spiritual worldviews often do, which is have kind of a theory of badness, an explanation of why bad things happen, and some ideas about what to do about that, to reduce the number of bad things, and often some corresponding moral guidance. Okay. Now I'm not talking here, so I am going to talk about evil, but I'm not talking about the so-called problem of evil, which gets particular discussion in the Christian tradition. In other words, I'm not asking why would an omnipotent and benevolent God permit suffering to happen, because for one thing, my worldview does not presuppose that there is a benevolent and omnipotent God. I actually will, in the 5th lecture, talk about some conceptions of God that are consistent with my worldview, and maybe even to some extent suggested by my worldview. But my worldview does not assert the existence of any God. So, in what sense am I going to talk about evil? Well, I think there are 2 main ways that evil gets talked about. One that is the most common these days, I think, is it's used to just mean very, very bad, right? Like Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs is evil, very, very bad. People who decapitate people on videotape are evil. So it's just kind of a degree of moral condemnation, the ultimate degree of moral condemnation. But there's, another, traditionally, in spiritual traditions, there's been another sense of the term evil, which is in a kind of explanatory sense. Okay, the question is, why do individual people do bad things? So in some spiritual traditions, you might get an answer like they are inhabited by evil spirits. In other traditions, you might get something more Manichaean, the idea that there is a cosmic global struggle between the forces of good and evil, perhaps conceived as metaphysical substances or something. But in any event, the goal is to explain why evil things happen. Now, these kinds of traditional conceptions of evil obviously don't fit very handily into a scientific worldview. Evil spirits, posited metaphysical substances. These are not the way scientists talk. And one thing I want to do tonight, in fact, the main thing I want to do tonight, is ask, is there a kind of a, you might say, scientifically respectable way of talking about evil? A conception of evil that does some of the explanatory work that conceptions of evil have done, explains why a lot of bad things happen, but is consistent with a scientific worldview. And this isn't just an academic question. I actually hope to shed light on why a lot of the bad stuff happening around the world is happening. So our story begins with the axis of evil. Most of you, many of you at least, look old enough to remember George Bush's axis of evil speech about Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. I'm old enough to have actually written about it. I wrote a piece in Slate about it, and I treated this idea of the axis of evil about as dismissively as you would expect someone of my ideological orientation to treat it. And I, in fact, drew a rebuke from the influential conservative blogger Instapundit. He said that my piece was, I think, quote, both dumb and snide. And believe it or not, that's not what most offended me. He also said, I think that what makes people being me, cringe about good-evil discussions is that if you admit that good and evil exist, that creates obligations to oppose evil and to support and be good. That's work, and it involves responsibility. So now he was accusing me of not just being dumb and snide, but lazy and irresponsible, so I decided he had gone too far, and I emailed him, and I said, you know, in kind of dismissing this Bush's conception of evil, I didn't mean to say that there are no morally bad things in the world. I'm not denying the existence of moral truth, but I took Bush to be speaking in a kind of Manichaean sense of evil. You know, the idea that maybe behind all of the bad acts in the world, there's an underlying metaphysical substance, and that's what inhabits the leader of Iraq or North Korea or whatever. You know, so in this conception of evil, the word doesn't mean bad. It kind of represents a grand unified theory of bad, okay? An attempt to explain something that is said to be able to explain all of the badness in the world. And to Instapundit's credit, his name is Glenn Reynolds. He wrote a follow-up post in which he modified his critique in keeping with my email. But, you know, in thinking about that, I started realizing that the idea of evil in the sense that I meant it was actually kind of appealing, right? If there's a single thing underlying all the bad things in the world, then you know where to focus your energies in combating it, right? You know, it's like in Lord of the Rings. I mean, I'm not a Lord of the Rings guy, but I gather there's Sauron is the evil person, and Mordor is Sauron's headquarters or whatever. So you focus your attack on the headquarters, right? You've got this one clear goal. You know, it wasn't easy, but at least it's a clear mission. So I started wondering, if you dispensed with the idea of a supernatural force, metaphysical substance, could you still come up with something that you thought was responsible, kind of a grand unified theory of bad, something, some human tendency or something that was responsible for all the bad things in the world? Or, since the answer to that is surely no, what's the closest you could come? Okay, what is the single thing that's responsible for more bad things than any other single thing? You know, what is a kind of you know, within a scientific worldview, what could you call a grand unified theory of bad? Well, my own candidate for that honor, I guess, is the failure to put yourself in the shoes of other people, particularly when that's very hard to do. Now, there's two senses in which you can mean put yourself in the shoes of other people. First of all, there's emotional empathy. That's the most familiar sense of the term empathy, you know, feeling their pain. And I do mean to include that because, you know, emotional empathy can be very important. It tends to be associated with acknowledging the moral worth of people. And of course, a lot of bad has been done by people who didn't acknowledge the moral worth of people or groups. And so I do, you know, I think that kind of empathy is important. But I'm mainly going to focus tonight on a second sense of empathy, sometimes called cognitive empathy, because I think its importance is really underrated. And cognitive empathy is just putting yourself in the shoes of other people in the sense of just understanding what's going on inside their head, how the world looks to them. You may not feel their pain, you may not like them, but you do the thought experiment and try to understand how the world looks from inside their head. So this, you know, this isn't always hard to do, this exercise, but sometimes it is. And when it is hard to do, I call it moral imagination, okay? Because you have to work, you have to use your imagination to put yourself in the shoes of someone. It doesn't happen naturally. Now, the term moral imagination has been used in various ways. Again, I like to use it to mean putting yourself in the shoes of other people when that's particularly challenging. It may be challenging for a number of reasons. It may just be that the person is in circumstances very different from the ones you're familiar with. And it may be for some other reasons that we'll come to that you have trouble exercising moral imagination. But I do think it's important to exercise it in the hardest cases because that's when I think it can do the most good. So this brings us back to the axis of evil. Iraq, of course, was one of the countries in the axis of evil. And, you know, you may recall that there was a run-up to the war, and then we went to war. And one thing you didn't, there was a lot of discussion about invading Iraq before we actually did it. But one thing you didn't much hear was, you know, hey, can we stop and just look at things from Saddam Hussein's perspective? You know, I didn't hear that, and I was definitely paying attention. And I think that actually, if we had done that, we might have saved ourselves some trouble. And here's what I mean by that. So just to recap, we invaded ostensibly because we thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, a whole program, including some actual weapons. Now, he was letting United Nations inspectors inspect any facility they wanted to inspect. Okay, so you might ask, well, why did we invade then? And part of the answer is that he did offer some resistance around the edges, okay? So, for example, we wanted to take his scientists out of the country and interrogate them, and he said, no way. And we concluded, well, it must mean he's got weapons of mass destruction. After all, why else would he refuse to let us take his scientists? Well, actually, if you think about it and put yourself in his shoes, you can imagine all kinds of reasons. I mean, in theory, maybe he was afraid they would defect, and they had other forms of valuable knowledge. I think maybe most plausibly, he didn't want to be any more humiliated in the face of his people than was necessary to avoid war. He'd already let these UN inspectors in, which was a major concession. There's a common misconception about dictators that they actually don't care what their people think of them. Actually, they care, I think, more than democratically elected leaders, and with good reason, because a lot of their people are not happy with them. In any event, there's all kinds of reasons that he could resist on this particular point. But anyway, we assumed the worst. We didn't exercise moral imagination. We had the war. It had all these consequences. It created ISIS, which is now, you know, the thing most called evil. Okay, so why is moral imagination, putting yourself in the shoes of another person, why is it so hard? Well, as I said, sometimes it's just that you're not familiar with their kind of circumstances. Most of us don't have any experience being brutal dictators, so that makes it kind of challenging to imagine being Saddam Hussein. But there are other reasons that I think are often more important, and these have to do with so-called cognitive biases, which have gotten a lot of attention in psychology lately. You've probably heard of the confirmation bias, where you only notice evidence consistent with your position. You don't notice evidence that's inconsistent with it. A little of that may have been going on here. In the case of Saddam Hussein, a little confirmation bias. But there's another cognitive bias that I think hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves, and I think it may be implicated as well. It's called an attribution error. Now, originally, This was called the fundamental attribution error, and the conception of it was that it worked like this, okay? It was a tendency in evaluating people's behavior to attribute too much significance to their disposition, the kind of person they are, and not enough to circumstances, situational factors. So, for example, if you're in a drugstore, you're at the checkout counter, someone's rude to the clerk, you think, that's a bad person. That's the normal reaction, that's a bad person. But more often than you might think, that's not typical behavior for them. They just had a bad day, or maybe the clerk was rude and you didn't see that. But anyway, there was thought to be a general tendency to underestimate situational influences on people's behavior. Now, it turned out, as more work got done, that actually it's a little more complicated than that. And whether you commit an attribution error depends on, and the nature of the attribution error depends on who the person is that you're evaluating, what their relationship is to you, and what kind of thing they've done. So the way it works is that with friends and allies, we are more likely, if they do something good, we tend to attribute that to disposition, to the kind of person they are. Whereas if they do something bad, we tend to explain that away with reference to circumstance. So maybe they did something under peer group pressure or something, but it wasn't the true them doing it. That's friends and allies. With rivals and enemies, it's exactly the opposite. So if they do something bad, well, that's the real them. That's dispositional, because they are, after all, bad people. They are enemies or rivals. You expect them to do bad things. If they do something good, then people are more likely to explain that in terms of situational forces. Maybe they were just doing something good under pressure, or to kind of show off, or whatever. Anyway, it's not the real them. Okay, so to get back to Saddam Hussein, he had been very clearly defined as the enemy. So when he did this bad thing, to not submit to our demands and let his scientists leave the country, it was bad by our definition. We didn't, since he was an enemy, there wasn't a natural inclination to go look for situational explanations. Maybe he's just doing this because of X, Y, or Z. That was not the inclination. The natural human inclination in a situation like that is just to say, well, that's par for the course. He's a bad guy. He does bad things. Okay, so I think that may have something to do, this is very conjectural, but I think that may have something to do with our failure to kind of, or the quickness with which we jump to conclusions in that case, because he had been defined as the enemy. Now, if you ask why had he been defined as the enemy, well, partly because he had done things inimical to the interests of the U.S. It wasn't a crazy designation, but it's also true that people who wanted to have a war had gone to great pains to define him as the enemy in the most extreme terms possible. And in light of this attribution error, I think you can see why it's an effective strategy to depict, if you want a war, to depict the leader as the enemy as decisively as possible, because given the attribution error, it's harder for them to get out of that box once they're in it. And a social scientist named Herbert Kellman has written about this. He writes, thus, attribution mechanisms promote confirmation of the original enemy image. Hostile actions by the enemy are attributed dispositionally and thus provide further evidence of the enemy's inherently aggressive, implacable character. Conciliatory actions are explained away as reactions to situational forces, as tactical maneuvers, responses to external pressure, or temporary adjustments to a position of weakness, and therefore require no revision of the original enemy image. Now, I'm not denying Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. In fact, I chose him because he was a bad guy, because my premise is that even with bad people, it can be valuable to exercise moral imagination. I could list a lot of not great people I would apply that to. I mean, Vladimir Putin is a not great person. I personally think if we had done a better job before the whole Ukraine mess of understanding what his perception was about his country's vital interests, we probably could have found a solution that was better for all concerned than the solution we wound up for, and wouldn't have involved any abject appeasement. I won't get into the scenario, but that at least is my view. And one thing this illustrates is that moral imagination can often be useful in solving non-zero-sum problems. In other words, when there's a potential for a win-win outcome or a lose-lose outcome, they can help the exercise of moral imagination, understanding the other person's perspective, can help steer you to the win-win outcome. Now, the people I would like to extend moral imagination to are not confined to world leaders. So, for example, young Muslims in Europe, in the United States, who may feel somewhat alienated, be on the verge of alienation. I would like to understand what's going in their head better. I think it would be productive for more Americans to put themselves in their shoes, because then we might have a clearer understanding of things we might do that would make them less or more alienated. Obviously, more alienated is bad news, as we've seen. There's a particular example of this. It's a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. So you remember the attacks on the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. Now, after the attacks, you may remember a lot of people marched through the streets of Paris with signs saying, "I am Charlie Hebdo, je suis Charlie." People were saying that on Twitter. And, I understood what they meant. What they meant was something that I would mean, that I embrace, which is, freedom of speech should be a fundamental value. You shouldn't be killed for saying anything, even if I personally find what you said, reprehensible. You just shouldn't be killed. I think that's what people meant by, I am Charlie Hebdo. But, if you put yourself in the shoes of, say, a French Muslim, remember Charlie Hebdo had published a number of cartoons that were not implausibly perceived as extremely insulting to the Prophet Muhammad. So if you're a Muslim, you may well, when you see somebody saying, "I am Charlie Hebdo," you may jump to the conclusion pretty naturally that they are embracing the actual content of that magazine. That's a not surprising misreading of the message. And I think if you're sending messages, you should try to send them clearly. And obviously the audience I'm talking about, Muslims in Paris and elsewhere, that's a really important audience for these people. I mean, their goal presumably is to decrease the number of violent attacks like this. So it would be good to know what effect that message has. And if you think it's too ambiguous, then just say it another way that's clearer. Now, so far this may sound like a left-wing message, the implications of moral imagination as I'm framing it, but I actually think it should be applied, symmetrically. So, for example, with Israel-Palestine, yes, I wish that more Israelis appreciated what it's like to live under occupation with basic human rights like due process denied and so on. I also think it would be good if more Palestinians understood that on the Israeli side, there is genuine fear. And that motivates, I think, more Israeli behavior than some people appreciate. Now, of course, if you're in Gaza, you're saying, like, fear? Are you kidding? I mean, your chances of, if you're Gazan, if you're a Palestinian in Gaza, your chances of being killed by an Israeli are higher by, I don't know how many orders of magnitude than the chances of an Israeli being killed by somebody in Gaza. But, fear is a funny thing. I mean, Americans, in my view, wildly overreact to terrorism and succumb to fear. After 9/11, we invaded 2 countries, not 1. And I think we've overreacted to a lot of these things. It seems to be kind of human nature. And I think, understanding that can be good. So similarly, I have spent a lot of time saying to people, saying to white people, I doubt you and I appreciate what it's like to be a young African American and have a pretty good suspicion that a cop is looking at you differently than he's looking at a white guy your age, or a store security guard or whatever. And I think that's very important. I've tried to, convince people to do that. But I also think it's important to extend moral imagination to cops, what's going on in their head. There again, I think sometimes more often than we might imagine, fear plays a role in behavior that might seem just purely malicious. In any event, whatever the answer, I'm saying I say apply moral imagination all across the board. Yes, I wish Trump supporters would ask, what's it like to be an immigrant? But I think it's worth asking, like, why do these people support Trump? What's going on in their head? I mean, after all, they're human beings. They're probably, in some sense, reacting to things in accordance with human nature. It's probably comprehensible. And so on, sexual orientation. Yes, I wish some conservatives would say, I wonder what it would be like to be born gay or to be trans. But I think it's also worth asking, I wonder what it's like to be the evangelical mother in Oklahoma who's homeschooling her children for fear of contact with modern values. What exactly is the nature of the fear? And so on. So I favor the radical and symmetrical extension of moral imagination. And one reason I call it radical is if you go around doing this and say, let's look at things from the point of view of all these people, you will get a ton of blowback, okay? That's one of the signs that you're saying something radical, is people will complain. And a lot of times the reason they'll complain is that they're equating explanation with exoneration, okay? They're saying that if you want to just explain why someone did something, then you are in some sense sympathizing or saying that they are not to blame. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can separate the question of explanation from the question of blame. But there is a strong human tendency, and I think this may be kind of built into our brains, to equate the two. So brace yourselves if you're going to go around doing this. I personally, because of an op-ed I wrote in the New York Times, was accused of, quote, sympathizing with terrorists. The good news is that the person who accused me was Ann Coulter. And, if you're going to get accused of some high crime, I say make it Ann Coulter. So when I attribute a lot of the badness in the world to a lack of moral imagination, in a way what I'm saying, I'm attributing it to kind of the lack of a scientific attitude. Because after all, a scientific attitude is, give me any phenomenon and I want to explain it as fully as possible. If Saddam Hussein is resisting our demands, I want to know what perceptions and thoughts and feelings are driving that reaction. And ideally, I'd like to know what in turn caused those perceptions. But in any event, I want to know. That's science, the search for the most complete answer possible. And I think moral imagination is the search for answers. Why are these people acting like this? So evil, in my sense of the term, could be described not just as the absence of moral imagination, but as a kind of absence of scientific spirit. And note that this conception of evil is roughly the opposite of some of these ancient conceptions of evil that I alluded to, because after all, if you're saying evil is some kind of supernatural force that inhabits people, then what you're saying is there's really no cause in the material world. So it's not really a scientific question like why the person is doing the bad thing. That is just not amenable to scientific analysis, according to these kind of ancient conceptions of evil as, supernatural force, metaphysical substance. In contrast, evil, in my sense of the term, presupposes that there is a scientific explanation. And indeed, I'm saying that evil is, in some sense, a failure to appreciate the explanation or pursue the explanation. And by the way, here there's an historical footnote. I've been using an ancient historical footnote. I've been using the term Manichaean kind of just generically to refer to a kind of a dualistic, a cosmically dualistic worldview. But Manichaeism was an actual articulated worldview in the ancient world. And I'm not an expert in it, so there's a chance that what I'm about to say is just wrong. But my impression is two things that are kind of interesting. St. Augustine flirted with Manichaeism, but then famously rejected it. And my understanding is that the way he came out on the question of evil was, he said, no, evil isn't like a thing. When bad stuff happens, what there is just the absence of good. It isn't the presence of evil, it's the absence of good, or something like that, he said. Now, I can't totally wrap my mind around that, to be honest. What absence of good, what would, But I am saying something kind of comparable in a certain sense, that that a lot of badness, at least, results from the absence of something, the absence of moral imagination, the absence of an attempt to actually understand the world. The other interesting thing and relevant thing about Manichaeism is that the idea, as I understand it again, in Manichaeism, I mean, again, I'm saying that what ultimately, conquers evil is understanding things better and better, more and more knowledge. Turns out this was in some sense the view of Manichaeism. The idea was that the ultimate conquest of evil would come through knowledge. So good was associated with knowledge, evil was associated with ignorance. So that, at least at a broad level, is kind of consistent with my worldview. So, 3 cheers for Manny. Manny is the guy who actually articulated Manichaeism. M-A-N-I, not M-A-N-N-Y. So, as I said last week when I spoke, I see this spiritual worldview of mine as residing in a space I called the New Agnosticism. It's not the same as the New Agnosticism. It's not the label for my worldview. But I see it as kind of residing within a larger territory I call the New Agnosticism. And in defining the New Agnosticism, I contrasted it with two things. First of all, the old agnosticism of the 19th century, I said that, agnosticism has always been about intellectual humility, about recognizing that if you aren't certain about something, whether there's a God or not a God, you shouldn't say you're certain about it. It's always been about intellectual humility and a reluctance to reach unwarranted conclusions. And I argued that actually, ironically, since then, science had given us more reason for intellectual humility, not less, partly because of all the weirdness about fundamental questions unearthed by physics, and the suggestion that the human mind will just never get to the bottom of these ultimate questions, partly because, ironically, behavioral science, I said, had actually crystallized the mystery of consciousness more clearly than it had been crystallized before. But in any event, I said there's more grounds for intellectual humility now than there were 150 years ago. The other thing I contrasted the New Agnosticism with is the New Atheism. As some of you who are here know, and probably most of you who weren't here know roughly what the New Atheism is. Because, as I said, the New Atheists, first of all, are kind of known for, many of them at least, known for not being very intellectually humble. That's one contrast. But also they disagree. Their views contrast with my views, my spiritual views in other senses, so they make good foils. I spent a lot of time using them as foils last time. I'm not going to do that. You may be happy to hear. But there is one theme from last week, one New Atheist theme that I promised to revisit, and I am going to revisit it because I think it is illuminated by what I've just said about the attribution error. Okay, so this was when Sam Harris, perhaps the seminal New Atheist, was looking at possible causes of terrorist behavior, and he listed them, Israeli occupation of the West Bank, collusion of Western powers with dictatorships, endemic poverty, lack of economic opportunity. He listed all these, and then he dismissed them in the following way. He said, but I will argue that we can ignore all of these things or treat them only to place them safely on the shelf because the world is filled with poor, uneducated, and exploited peoples who do not commit acts of terrorism, indeed who would never commit terrorism of the sort that has become so commonplace among Muslims. Now, as I pointed out last week, that's just a fallacy. That's exactly like saying smoking couldn't cause lung cancer because the world is full of people who smoke and don't get lung cancer. Or it's actually like saying something Sam definitely wouldn't like. Religion couldn't be the cause of terrorism. Islam couldn't be the cause of terrorism because the world is full of religious people and Muslims who don't commit terrorism. There's one thing I would add now in light of this attribution error, which is that I think it's actually quite plausible, I don't know, but that if you ask why would somebody, in a book, this is his magnum opus, The End of Faith, in a presumably well-considered book, commit a fallacy this kind of glaring, it could well be an instance of the attribution error. I mean, remember, Sam presumably thinks of terrorists not irrationally as the enemy. And if you're thinking of them as the enemy and the kind of attribution error colors your thinking, then you're going to tend to dismiss situational explanations of their behavior because part of you wants to think that they are just locate all badness within the person as part of their character. That's a natural thing to do. It's certainly possible that that's what was going on here. In any event, the second thing I'd say about this is, although Sam isn't using the word evil here, his view is in some ways the functional equivalent of the kind of old-fashioned supernatural view of evil, right? I mean, remember, there the view is that you are possessed by this evil, it's unconnected to the physical world, no explanation. Well, Sam imagines these people being inhabited by malicious religious belief, and at least in this passage, seems to basically rule out all possible environmental explanations of it. At least you could use the kind of logic he's using to dismiss any posited situational environmental cause. So, I'm sure if I asked him this, he'd have an answer, and he'd argue that, no, I explain beliefs in X, Y, and Z way. But it seems to me there's a tendency here not to want to explain them in kind of scientific terms. I mean, unless he's going to say, well, it's all like in the genes, they're just genetically defective or something. I mean, because he does seem to be ruling out environmental explanations just by the structure of his logic. In any event, leave aside whether his view is the functional equivalent of a supernatural conception of evil. It's certainly, I would say, not a very scientific attitude. The scientific attitude aims to explain things as fully as possible. It wants to ask, like, why do some people have a belligerent interpretation of their scripture, whereas others don't? And in contrast, I would say the new agnosticism, as I conceive it, is more infused with a scientific spirit. And in that sense, my emphasis on moral imagination, it's kind of natural that it's part of a worldview that I locate within the new agnostic space. Okay, so that's my attempt to come up with a grand unified theory of bad. If I had to use the word evil in a modern way, that's the way I would do it. The truth is, though, I would just assume that we drop the word evil altogether, because let's face it, I'm not going to convince the world to use evil the way I use it. They're going to continue to use it the way they do. And the connotations of the word evil, I said at the outset that one thing it means to people is just very, very, very bad. But often when they use it that way, they also mean something else. They kind of mean beyond the reach of scientific explanation. They mean it's just incomprehensibly bad. It's just, you just can't imagine what would possess a person. So it has some of that ancient connotation to it, I think, the word evil, beyond scientific explanation. And as you can probably tell, I don't think that's a very productive view, to say that there's no point in asking what's going on inside of the heads of people who do bad things. So, I just think the word evil, the way it's used, short circuits moral imagination. So you might say that evil as the word is used is evil in my sense of the word. So I don't know, but if you say it's evil to use the word evil, then you get drawn into this, you collapse in paradox. So I would just as soon skip the word. But I stand by my position that lack of moral imagination is a huge problem. Okay, so let me just get back to what I said at the outset, that this exploration of evil was in the service of fleshing out a spiritual worldview. So again, spiritual worldviews often have theories about why bad things happen and corresponding moral guidance. My moral guidance is exercise moral imagination. That's like a central pillar of my worldview. Another feature of spiritual worldviews, and I alluded to this last time, is often the idea that in our ordinary consciousness, our ordinary way of looking at the world, there's something incomplete or misleading. Okay, so Buddhists say we live in a world of delusion. St. Paul said, being in this world is like looking through a glass darkly, but, when salvation comes or liberation comes, depending on the terminology of your religion, things will be clearer. Well, there is, in my view, very much the idea that ordinary consciousness is not reliable. And I think this is backed up by psychology's growing documentation of cognitive biases, and more deeply, by the argument from evolutionary psychology that the human mind was designed to get genes into the next generation. If that means seeing things clearly, fine, that's what we will do. And sometimes the mind does see things clearly. But if delusion will help you get genes into the next generation, or our ancestors get genes in the next generation, then delusion there will be. And it's important to appreciate how subtle these biases can be, As I've said, I think, one way of looking at some of the biggest problem with the world today, in a different sense, is, the psychology of tribalism, whether it's religious, nationalistic, ideological tribalism of the kind we're seeing in America. And consistently, the psychology of tribalism is sustained by these cognitive biases. And just to illustrate how subtle some of them are, when you think of tribal psychology, you may think of like rage. But rage, when it's happened, right? When you're seized by rage, you may not be thinking, I'm enraged, but the next day, most people will go, well, that was rage, right? Whereas, if you look at the cognitive biases that are involved in getting you so morally indignant and convinced of your own rightness that you get into a moralistic rage, including the attribution error, you could go your whole life without being aware of that bias, right? It just so subtly infiltrates our evaluations of people that we're just not aware of it. And I think that's, this is one reason, the subtlety of these biases is one reason that I think sometimes it takes an actual spiritual discipline to make much progress against them. My own favorite spiritual discipline is meditation. I think, I have a daily practice, I go to retreats, and I think particularly some variants of meditation are very good at getting you to understand your mind better and understanding what's actually going on in it. And I guess I should admit at this point that, a certain amount of my spiritual worldview is Eastern in nature. I'm pretty taken by not just the potential of meditation, by certain parts of Buddhist philosophy and psychology. But there's another sense in which my worldview is kind of Western. I said that often spiritual worldviews have a kind of a cosmic narrative, a view of history. And the Western versions of those in particular tend to be kind of linear and often apocalyptic, the Abrahamic versions of these historical narratives. And I have a little of that in me. I do think that technological evolution in particular has kind of impelled humans to higher and higher levels of social organization. So getting to this point of globalization was very likely. And so too was the kind of moral threshold it puts us on, where either we cohere as a global community or things may spiral downward. And next week, I'm going to elaborate on all that. And next week, my interrogator, the person doing the work that Paul Bloom is doing this week, will be John Horgan, the famously contentious science writer who's guaranteed to provide at least as much pushback as I want. So before we bring Paul up, one final point about spiritual worldviews. There is often in them an element of self-help, right? They promise to make people happier and healthier. And I actually think moral imagination could do a little of that, seeing things from other people's point of view, precisely because it can help you play non-zero-sum games, can make relations better at work, can make, I think, a marriage more harmonious, and so on. So it can pay off in terms of immediate self-interest. At the same time, one thing that I think makes moral imagination qualify as a spiritual exercise is that it involves the recognition that it's not just about you, and that getting out of your perspective, getting out of your natural vantage point can bring a literally truer view of the world, and certainly a more constructive view. Thank you. So Paul, by way of introduction, I'm sure a lot of you know Paul. You can proceed. This is so informal that I'm not going to. We're not waiting for the introduction to build to a crescendo before you walk on amid thunderous applause.
I need like the final countdown, that sort of thing.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, 0. Yeah. We're here. So Paul, anyway, very well known, writes regularly for The Atlantic. Among his books are How Pleasure Works, Just Babies. By the way, just is a pun there. It's about the early development of moral intuition. So don't complain that there's stuff in the book other than babies. It doesn't mean just babies.
Take that, Amazon reviewers.
Right. Amazon reviewers have been known to complain that there are things in the book other than babies. And Paul's done, important, we share broadly the perspective of evolutionary psychology, so in that sense we're on the same page. But Paul has lately been articulating some views about empathy, suggesting that it is sometimes not a great thing, and I think that may be in some sense true. I'm not sure how much we disagree about that, but in any event, why don't you take it, say anything you want about me, and ask anything.
So I'm very grateful to have been invited here, and I'm supposed to sort of provide conflict and get Bob to spell out his views. But I'm going to go off script just for a minute and just say how much I admire his work in general, and in particular sort of project he's taking on here. So if you've read his books, and you should, you'll see this sort of relentless, careful scientific project trying to provide robust causal explanations for all sorts of aspects of human behavior, informed by the best psychology, by neuroscience, and particularly by evolutionary theory. And in this regard, I think he's equal to the sort of the very best who do this, people who I admire very much, like Steve Pinker or Jared Diamond. But in addition, Bob has his more spiritual side, that is where there's a sort of anxiety about the overconfidence he sees in some other intellectual projects. There's a desire and an interest in a more transcendent, finding a transcendence in this work. And it makes, there's nobody like that. There's nobody who would give a talk like he just gave, and I think that's just terrific.
Okay, thank you. You can go now.
Yeah.
I've got a feeling that whatever comes next is not going to be on the...
Yeah, you wish. Your talk is about the moral imagination. You started by correctly, and we'll go back to this, correctly saying, there's something which Roy Baumeister has called the myth of pure evil. And this is the idea that what evil is this spirit, this amorphous thing that maybe is mystical, and some people are just got it, and there's nothing you do about it, and they're totally different from us. Well, it turns out that across every study you look at, evil people are, for the most part, us. They're just how other people see us, see you when your interests clash. The Israelis think the Palestinians are evil, the Palestinians think the Israelis are evil. Baumeister's done interview studies where he looks at people in conflict. And he looks at people who have done something bad to somebody else. And if you've done something bad to somebody else, and you're asked, describe what you did, you say, well, it was pretty small, I didn't mean it, I didn't intend, I felt very bad afterwards. And then you ask people instead, describe when somebody's done something bad to you. You'll say, man, it was just this bastard, just for the pure kicks of it, did this horrible thing, doesn't seem to be forgiving at all. And you get this radical difference. And so you need to unpack it and realize that if you want to understand evil, you should sort of basically look at ourselves. Now, so this is I'm leading up to my first question, which is, the conclusion you seem to want us to take away from this, or one conclusion, is that lack of moral imagination is a major cause of evil, maybe the cause of evil. But interestingly, you never actually make that argument. So I would have thought you'd say, well, take ISIS, or Saddam Hussein, or Hitler, or somebody we'll all view as evil. Let's look at different candidate explanations for why they're evil, and we're going to discover its lack of moral imagination is going to rise to the top. But instead what you argue, I think tremendously convincingly, is that moral imagination, perspective taking, is a great thing to have. It would have helped us avoid unnecessary wars. It will help us deal with conflicts. It will help us meet our enemies and best them, or convert them, or make them not our enemies anymore, to ally ourselves with our friends. And that's a really good case to make. But the other case, that evil is caused by lack of moral imagination, it isn't an argument I saw you making, and I actually find it implausible as a psychologist. So there are studies, for instance, of bullies. And you might think, because people are supposed to think this, that bullies are people with pure social skills. Bullies actually test very high on social skills. Bullies are very good in particular at figuring out what goes on in the heads of other people. That's what makes them good bullies. The people who are bad at perspective taking and social skills, those are the victims of bullies. Psychopaths are a variegated group, but some psychopaths are actually really good at what you call moral imagination. Because in order to con somebody of their life savings or seduce somebody or trick somebody, you've got to get into their heads, feel what they want, what they know, where they're coming from. And I don't doubt that Vladimir Putin and Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler were pretty good at sussing out what's going on in the heads of their enemies because they were incredibly successful at carrying out their evil projects. And so for this reason, I'm skeptical that moral imagination is the magic bullet you think it is.
Okay. First of all, a technical point. I'm not saying that lack of moral imagination explains evil. As a technical matter, I'm defining evil in the modern sense as the thing that explains more bad than anything else. So the lack of moral imagination is evil by virtue of that.
Yeah.
I generally would just dispense with the word evil, but that's a little bit of a distinction. And you're right, I haven't compellingly, gone through history and made the case. And I'm sure there are counterexamples. Again, the claim isn't that it underlies all bad or that all bad would be removed if we were better at it. But I would say, you brought up ISIS. Well, as I said, if we had avoided the Iraq War, I don't think ISIS would be here. But more than that, I think throughout the war on terror, there has been a consistent tendency to respond to terrorism with exactly the thing that makes the problem worse.
Yeah.
And that includes invading Iraq. It includes, to my mind, many more drone strikes than are a good idea. I think we've, as far as the surveillance of mosques, who knows whether they're going overboard, but I think there's been lack of appreciation, lack of discussion, that there's just clearly a downside. If people who already feel marginalized and alienated start feeling that they are being subjected to persecution, there's a real downside. So I think the war on terror has consistently lacked adequate evaluation of what's going on in the minds of the people that you are worried about becoming terrorists. And I think as a result of that, it's become this positive feedback system, where in response to terror, we do something that makes the terror worse, and on and on and on. So that's at least a view. Again, I haven't, there are specific examples there I'd cite. Even making that argument, persuasively would take a while. But you brought up ISIS, so that's what I would say about ISIS.
I find it utterly convincing. Right. It's just there's two questions that are somewhat separate. One question is, how should we deal with ISIS? Suppose you want to kill them all. Mm-hmm. Well, then you're planning. So get in their heads. What do they want? What are they planning? What would hurt them the most? Totally agree. Suppose we want to, if you have a goal in mind involving people, whether it's a good goal or a bad goal, getting in their heads is a superb way to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's question, and I'm convinced of that. But the second question is, what makes ISIS ISIS? Or the Ku Klux Klan, or whatever, any evil group that we characterize as evil, what makes them what they are? And to me, it seems like, I don't doubt that the members of ISIS are poor at perspective taking. But it seems...
Yeah, but I'm not saying that I think they do actually lack moral imagination. It's not so much the technical ability to do perspective taking, but for example, they are misreading us just as we are misreading some of them, or we are misreading people who might join ISIS. They take, like Je suis Charlie. As I said, it wasn't a well-designed message. At the same time, it was misunderstood. There wasn't an adequate job done, I think. I doubt an adequate job was done by everyone on the other side of understanding what was meant. I think, a lot of the things that we do that are taken to mean we are at war with Islam do not actually mean that. So if they did understand our actual motivations better, those motivations, those actions would not be as incendiary. So I actually do think there probably is a failure of moral imagination there. At the same time, I'm not saying that everyone who does something bad, that person lacks moral imagination, and that's the problem. As you said, psychopaths, not the problem. In fact, moral imagination may help them do their work more efficiently. Now, I was aware of that, and I kind of tried to fudge by at least mentioning this capacity for emotional empathy. And I think in non-psychopaths, I would guess, it's an interesting question, that there's a kind of symmetrically interactive relationship between, I would guess that if you're not a psychopath, successful perspective taking makes you more prone to emotional empathy with a person. And by the same token, I certainly think emotional empathy facilitates perspective taking. I think that's the reason that we do it automatically with like family members and close friends, whereas not so much with enemies. But I'm not, again, in the end, there is no grand unified theory. My claim is, and I haven't even studied this exhaustively enough to convince myself, my claim is that if you could change one human tendency that would do the most good, it would be this ability, or often the lack of ability, to just understand the perspective of the other person.
It's an interesting claim.
I should say, I was once listening to a radio show. It turned out, I think it was the guy who wrote one of these books like Getting to Yes or something. Anyway, it was like one of these, negotiation books about how to negotiate non-zero sum situations. I came into it halfway. I didn't know who it was, but I heard them talking about game theory, and the radio announcer said, "What do you think is the biggest problem in the world?" And I just knew, it just popped into my head, I know they're going to say the failure of people to understand the perspective of others. And that's exactly what this person said. And whoever this person was is actually a credentialed expert, unlike me. So in the end, I'm using authority. I appeal to authority, not scriptural authority, but professional authority.
I'm kind of an expert myself in a few things.
Well, I won't get in the way between the fight between you and the guy on the radio.
So I'm trying to frame this in terms of a question, but I just disagree. So I'll just say this. You do these studies where they give people all these tests, and they look at how well they do on the psychological tests. And they see how this relates to aggression. So there's a huge analysis looking at empathy and physical aggression, sexual aggression, and verbal aggression. Everything from prison populations to people in retirement communities, the whole shebang. And the relationship is zero. There's like no correlation.
Wait, there's a correlation between what and what?
Between lack of empathy and propensity to commit aggressive acts.
Lack of emotional empathy.
They looked at every sort of empathy, and they found that the correlations here are incredibly low. Do you know what does, so this is a different view here, what does predict violence? If I had to give you people one test to figure out who's the most likely to kill me, it would be self-control. And this speaks to a different model of what's going on. Would you view it as a friendly amendation to your theory that it's not so much dialing up the ability to take others' perspective, but dialing up the significance, the moral significance you give to other people?
Well, again, I'm not arguing that, in the everyday world, people who do bad things are lacking in empathy. I mean, it kind of gets to what your own critique of empathy, I think, is. That, a normal human being has plenty of empathy for like people in their family, people in their tribe. Nazi soldiers had empathy with one another, presumably, and so on. And this is kind of your argument, right? So, first of all, I want to emphasize on the test, I wouldn't expect to find in that sense a like generic correlation between capacity for empathy in the ordinary human sense and whether or not you do good things. I mean, from my point of view, the whole problem with empathy, and I think from yours, is that people tend to use it in the ordinary human sense. People in my tribe deserve sympathy, and I can understand their perspective. And this is one reason I made a point of defining moral imagination as extending cognitive empathy in those cases where it's most challenging, right? Because that's when it will do the most good. And I doubt the people who commit these crimes are deploying their empathy when it's the most challenging, like when they're about to stab somebody. I doubt they're they're paralyzed by empathy, right? And that's my problem. I want people to extend mainly cognitive empathy, but both across tribal lines, so to speak. That's the challenging part. That's the not natural part. So I am for the non-natural deployment of empathy.
So let me give an example which fits from your point of view and then go a different place with it. I was watching the Republican primaries on the debates, not this round, but the last round 4 years ago. And the issue of 9/11 came up. And Santorum, very conservative, was saying this, they hate our freedom, it's monstrous, it's an inexplicable act of evil that must be snuffed out. Picture perfect the argument, the thing you're arguing against. Then Ron Paul, and this was an unusual debate, stood and said something I wouldn't imagine Democrats would have the guts to say, which is that, you got to think about the motivations for why these people did that. You have to put this in a context. How would you feel if in your nation bombs were dropping, killing children, killing people? Wouldn't you want to rise up and attack the people doing it? Did not go over well. But he was channeling his inner Robert Wright and extending the moral.
And you see where it got him politically, right?
That's right. But here's one reason to worry about it if you're a politician or even if you're a moralist, which is, in some way you said, it's not true that to explain is to excuse. That it is possible to understand what's going on in somebody and still blame them morally. But I would submit it's harder.
It's hard. It is hard.
It's harder because if you convince me that other nations view Obama's drone attacks exactly the same way we see 9/11, but I don't think Obama's a moral monster. When I start thinking that way, it causes me to question it starts me to erode my moral passion.
Right.
And I guess you might think that's just a good thing.
No, I mean, I think it is a danger. I think, again, people naturally, they have the intuition apparently, and I think will ultimately have a clear kind of explanation in terms of evolutionary psychology. I suspect it's engineered into the brain by natural selection. Our intuition that if you can explain people's behavior fully, they are not morally responsible for it. That's a strong intuition, and you're right that that's a danger. And people have worried about this in other contexts that, once we understand fully the relationship between serotonin and violence, we won't be able to lock people up. First of all, that hasn't been a problem, actually, in the criminal court system, not a raging problem that we're reluctant to lock people up, even though the brain science has advanced more and more. But what I would say is, if it's a problem, well, first I should step back and say my own view is that punishment is actually always, in a sense, regrettable. And an enlightened person would always punish with regret, just as a practical necessity. And I kind of think that, if I'm right, and to kind of save the world, so to speak, we're going to have to get better at deploying moral imagination, be unafraid to explain bad behavior. Then we are also going to have to get better at separating the question of culpability, or at least punishability, from the question of explanation. That may be another challenge facing humanity, as I suspect it is.
A philosopher I know, Owen Flanagan, has a book coming out on anger, and he talks about a dialogue he had with the Dalai Lama, where you get to ask the Dalai Lama like one question. And his question was great. He asked, would you kill Hitler? Would you have killed Hitler if it would have ended? And so Dalai Lama is very excited. He translates and he's talking to his advisors. And the answer was, yes, I would. But I would do it with a lot of ceremony and I wouldn't be angry at him.
Right.
And it's and the sense is it's regrettable. Killing somebody, punishing somebody is regrettable. You're better off not doing it. You should view it in some way as like a surgical procedure to make the world better.
No, it's funny, this is kind of related. Once I was on a meditation retreat, and you get into this state of mind that's just different. And I remember, now strictly speaking, you're not supposed to kill even bugs on a retreat. Let me admit right off the bat, I broke that rule because there was a mosquito on my arm, and I remember breaking the rule, but I remember being struck by how different it was in that frame of mind. I had no panic, no alarm, no ill will toward the mosquito. But I just understood that, they can carry disease and so on. It's gross that they're sucking your blood, whatever. It was, this sounds trivial, but that separation from kind of rage and retribution from punishment is I think a necessary, is an important thing, and may be more important as we go along.
So that brings to a sort of general concern people could have about your program, which is asking too much. And I think, I want to sort of go back to moral imagination in that regard. Steve Pinker, in his book Better Angels of Our Nature, talks about the decline of violence, and there's a part where he talks about the injunction to love thy neighbor, and then also to love thy enemy. And he says, I don't love my neighbor, I certainly don't love my enemy, but I don't think you should kill them. Rather, I have a notion of human rights and human respect that doesn't require an emotional bond or emotional tie. And I think, so the argument here against the force of the moral imagination is a degree of humility, which is that I don't think I'm capable of actually imagining what it's like to be a black teenager harassed by the police. And I don't think I'm able to do it cognitively. I mean, it's too different from my own life, let alone somebody in the Sudan or somebody in ISIS who were my enemy. So it's too hard. And also, even if I could do it cognitively, emotionally, I'm not going to care for some stranger as much as I care for my child or a member of my tribe. Again, that's asking too much. And so the alternative is you have sort of more abstract systems of laws and human rights, and you don't actually go through all the craziness of trying to put yourself in other people's shoes.
Well, right, but I mean, if nobody's, I mean, I would argue that putting yourself in other people's shoes is what leads to a robust system of civil liberty and equality under the law in the first place. And if we became more and more deficient at that, some of this would tend to collapse. I mean, look. Right now we have proposals to ban Muslims from coming into the country and so on. So these threats are always under challenge, and I can certainly imagine cases where if more people were better at moral imagination, there would not be these recommendations. But again, I think part of it is I didn't make a huge deal of emotional empathy. I'm not asking Steve Pinker to love everybody, but I think doing the intellectual work of understanding and explanation when it's the hardest is in a way what leads to the kind of society he's saying he would like to live in.
Just focusing on cognitive empathy, if you could take people who are now, we view as evil, engaged in bad projects, is your view that if you could turn up their cognitive empathy, turn up their dial of understanding of others, it would make them better people?
No, again, it's not, and we should open this up soon because they may have questions for me or you, but it's not mainly, the argument is not mainly that bad people who do bad things do them because they lack moral imagination. That's not it. It's that when people threaten, may wind up doing things that would be bad for you and maybe bad for them and bad for everybody, exercising moral imagination. So the Putin case, it's like Ukraine he considered it within his sphere of influence. He even had a naval base in Crimea. When we have comparable situations, America, a country close to them that we consider within our sphere of influence, especially if we have a military base, of course we would stage a coup. We've done it again and again and again under much less compelling circumstances. We do it all the time. Okay, so now if you had said, actually there's a chance that this guy will do kind of what we do all the time, then you might have done something like this. The European Union might have said, okay, to get the trade benefits of being in the European, Ukraine does not have to leave the Soviet trade bloc, which is one thing Putin found so threatening. Okay, that kind of thing might have saved everybody a lot of trouble, but the relatively few people who are talking that way, like Steve Cohen, got vilified for being commie sympathizers or something. That happens all the time. So I am to no small extent actually thinking about geopolitics. I mean, if you just look at the various miscalculations that got us where we are today, okay, and then I will stop and we'll open it up, but you know, the original intervention in Afghanistan, the decision under Jimmy Carter and then Reagan to turn Afghanistan into a proxy war and arm the Afghans, which again was taken out of way excessive fear of what the Soviet Union might do of us if they retained possession of a country right on their border anyway. I think that led to both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's a twofer, okay. It's just a simple miscalculation, a misestimation of what the various players would do. And then again, because it led to Al-Qaeda, it led to the Iraq War, which led to ISIS, you know. We repeatedly do things at the surely geopolitical level that involves just a failure to predict what the various players are going to do, just as human beings, that has come back to haunt us again and again.
So would it be fair to say that you're not offering a unified theory of where evil comes from, but a unified theory of how to deal with evil?
Well, I think, no, to some extent, the same. I'm just limiting how unified I think it is. Again, it's not a grand unified theory. It's the closest I think I can come. But I do mean it both diagnostically and prescriptively. Yeah. Okay. So, yes, sir.
I partly argue against moral empathy, but it seems to me that what you're saying ignores. I wouldn't argue against moral empathy. I think it's a good thing, but it seems to me that what you're saying ignores the fact that people who are morally empathetic can do incredibly immoral things as a result. And I tend to agree with your view that we probably should ban the word evil and not apply it to either cognitive states or to people's characters and so on, and focus on whether what an individual does is, whether his action, not his character, not his thought, his cognitive state or anything else, is moral or immoral. To take the concrete examples, I mean, I think there are very few people who actually who do evil things who would actually say that they're not being empathetic. I mean, take your neocon who gets you into Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. I'm sure that person feels that he's being completely empathetic, or many of them do, think that they're being completely empathetic, with the people over there. They want freedom. They,
But they're not.
The Belgians in the
but you know what? Neocons tend to be very bad at this. Actually, they consistently describe the politics within Iran in a way that is totally detached from the reality of the situation. Show no appreciation of the internal politics within Iran and the corresponding pressures that leaders are under. I'm not saying they don't think they're good at it. I'm saying they're not good at it. Okay? I'm not arguing for thinking you're a good person. The biggest problem with the world is that everybody thinks they're a good person.
Well,
I'm arguing for the actual deployment of moral imagination.
I don't think you put them all in a single basket, but I think some of them think they are being morally empathetic.
They do.
It's
They do
just
think
their
that.
actions-
But the other thing is,
their actions are immoral.
but the other thing I'd say is what I said to Paul. Certainly, empathy leads to a lot of bad behavior. The famous Texas cheerleader mom, she emphasized with her daughter, who was trying out for cheerleader, and she really wanted her to get that slot. So she plotted to have the mother of her daughter's rival killed. That's going too far with empathy. But that's, an extreme case of a natural deployment of empathy in the sense that it was directed toward a family member. What I'm in favor of is, so to speak, the unnatural deployment of empathy to other families, to other tribes, and so on.
But even that, the contemporary politician now who uses empathy the most to further his goals is Donald Trump. So if you look at Donald Trump's anti-immigration speeches, they're never, awful hatred. It's not just that. In every speech, there's discussion, and Ann Coulter does this too in her book, which I bought. I feel bad about that. Which is they talk about the victims of illegal immigrants.
Right.
People who are raped, children who are killed,
right.
Innocent people who are killed. Donald Trump talks about Kate all the time. who's Kate, just the first name, because it's a woman in California who was murdered by an undocumented immigrant. And he extends the moral imagination, trying to get you, I mean, I don't mean to be dismissive, but in a way to get you to feel sympathy for somebody and hence feel anger towards a competing group. So it's a tool that could be used in different ways.
Okay, but what kind of, I mean, whose perspective is he actually illuminating there?
This is more emotional empathy.
Okay,
It's
that's not my emphasis.
Yeah.
Maybe right there, Philip, and...
Hi, thank you. Given what was said about, what you said about humans just not having the capacity to sustain moral imagination, and given the context of a globalized world and the amount of cultures and religions that we have potentially clashing, I'm wondering what you see as our tools or institutions or structures that we have in place in society that would have the potential for people to institute this moral imagination.
It's a good question. I mean, is this for...
I guess this is for you, and this is keeping in mind the evolutionary context of humans, which is that we just do not have the ability to take care of as many people as we are currently responsible for in our globalized world.
So I just to frame this, I totally agree with the importance of putting ourselves, seeing where other people are coming from. It's good if we want to help them. It's good if we want to kill them. It's in some way, it's a form of social intelligence is a form of intelligence, and like any intelligence, it's a tremendously valuable tool. I'd rather be smart than dumb. I'd rather have my enemies be dumb than smart, which is my worry. When I was talking about limitations, I was talking about something more feelings for others, emotional empathy, and so on. And there, I think we are starkly limited. I think we are by nature, we will care immensely more about those around us than about strangers, than about non-human animals, and about people in faraway lands, and so on. And so, for that, I think reason why I don't kill, I wouldn't be in favor of killing somebody in a faraway country, isn't because, I love them as much as I love my son, but rather because I have conceptions of the equality of people, of human rights, and so on. And so I think the rights revolution, that sort of thing, does the trick morally in a way that emotional empathy can't. But I want to say, this is sort of a separate topic from the moral imagination, which is more cognitive.
Yeah, I was totally separate. I mean, again, that system of laws you championed didn't spring up automatically. I think it evolved as a result of a lot of kind of non-zero contact among different kinds of people, different kinds of cultures, but I'll get into that more next week. In response to the question of how you might institutionally foster moral imagination, I don't know, technologies could in principle be helpful. This Humans of New York thing, I think, is an amazing phenomenon for those of you who know. It's just this guy in New York who started going around taking pictures of people in New York, called it Humans of New York, and he does such a great job of like humanizing people who are in very different circumstances from yours. He takes a picture, he shares a quote from them, and you just go, you have any number of reactions. They're generally positive. And he's made trips abroad to Iran and so on, and has crossed national lines. A lot of that kind of, I mean, who knows? You can also imagine trying to introduce this into the curriculum. Philip, since you're right there, and there's somebody with a question right there.
Thank you. My question is, to the moral imagination, is there, in your thinking about this, anything that you would call perhaps an evil imagination? And I'm asking this with an example perhaps in mind, since ISIS has been brought up several times. I watched with some curiosity and horror, but also curiosity, the destruction of Palmyra over the year. And it was hard to watch it and not feel that there was a very deep pleasure that was involved in this level of destruction, and the exhibitionism that was involved in it, and the whole holding the world at sort of, almost a palpable tension in which pleasure was being derived on that end and horror and terror on our end, and it feels, without going to the extent of calling it evil by entity, it feels palpable and imaginative in its destruction. How do you think towards that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I disapprove. It's a common thing. I mean, Americans read about people killed in drone strikes and feel good just because they tell us these are people who deserve to die, and we don't really know. And you know, the American response to the bombing of Hiroshima, I think, was probably disturbingly favorable. I mean, you know, this is what I would like to avoid in the world. I mean, you can, you know, call it, you can call that evil if you want in your terms. I mean, again, I'm arguing that you could avoid a certain number of these things if you consistently were better at understanding what's motivating the people whose behavior you would like to modify. Sean, do you want to, in the front row, and then after this, maybe we should take several in a row, and just several, we'll respond to John's, and then take several in a row without response, and then we can both say what we want in response to them.
A wonderful talk and response, as always. I'm wondering if there isn't between the two of you a kind of classical argument happening between the relative priority of knowledge and will. With you coming down hard on knowledge, and Paul making an argument that, you know, you can know a lot of things and still will badly. And I think something like that might be going on here. I mean, I remember many years ago I was reading Woody Allen, and there was this little narrative he wrote in which one guy says to the other, did you hear that Socrates got mugged behind the Acropolis the other day? And the guy said, no, what happened? Well, two youths came up to him, and they were about to mug him, and Socrates explained to them that, you know, evil was merely an absence of knowledge of the good. And then what happened? Well, they punched him in the nose. You know, and it was hilarious because it was clear that the knowledge argument wasn't going to do anything about rectifying the will.
Right.
The will not to injure, even if you know that what you're about to do is. So you've been emphasizing the sort of cognitive work of cultivating empathy, and Paul keeps saying, look, lots of people who are very smart at doing that don't actually will the good.
Right.
And you know, this, of course, was Augustine's argument that the root of evil is not so much cognition, but a distorted will, and willing the wrong thing, even when one knows what the right thing to do is. So I'm wondering if you couldn't make the same argument, even from Buddhist resources, that cognitive empathy, unguided by a fundamental orientation of compassion, is just not going to be sufficient.
I think that part is true. Again, psychopaths with moral imagination can do more harm than psychopaths without. But what I should maybe emphasize more is how much I mean to focus on non-zero-sum problems. By definition, these are problems where both parties could come out better if they worked things out. So, for example, in Syria, hasn't worked out for us, hasn't worked out for Bashar Assad, you know, hasn't worked out for his neighbors who originally mounted the, kind of started the proxy war with him during the Syrian insurrection, started arming the rebels who are now like flooded with refugees and face a greater threat of terrorism themselves and so on. It hasn't worked out for anybody. So that's a case where, and I'm not sure you could have averted that. I have some ideas, but that's in a case where it was just in the interest of all the major players to avoid what happened. Okay, so in a non-zero-sum problem, you're just appealing to self-interest, to just rational self-interest on all sides. So, you know, whereas the guys who punched Socrates, it was a zero-sum situation. If they could get away with the crime, that was a zero-sum situation. So it wasn't in their self-interest to refrain from committing the crime. But if you look around at the world, at all the non-zero-sum games that do not get played to to a win-win solution, if you could just solve that problem, I think that would be transformative. So the question of will, again, this is why I'm not emphasizing emotional empathy. I'm saying cognitive empathy combined with simple self-interest, which is something we can generally assume on the part of people, can often solve major problems and avert tragedies.
And I hear Paul saying that won't do it, because self-will is the core of the problem. Because even if you know that there might be some element of self-interest here, you're not necessarily going to act on it, because I think there's even a kind of temptation to want, perhaps, a win that results in a loss to the other.
So there's two sorts of weakness of will issues. One is you may not care about other people. For zero-sum games, that would come out, Socrates' muggers.
Right.
And if you don't care about other people, increasing your moral imagination, I worry, might do more harm than good. But then there's another type, which is, suppose you are on a non-zero-sum game, you might have a sadistic will and want others to suffer, or you may you might have a greediness, which is you're unwilling to wait out the long-term goal and going to have a short-term goal.
Yeah, I mean the sadism would have to be sadomasochism, right? Because
Yes.
you're saying they would want to inflict pain even if it was not in their own interest to do it. Well, yeah, I don't have a cure for sadomasochism. That's true.
We'll discuss it later.
So Philip, will you just hand the microphone to like 3 people in a row, and we'll write down what they say. Please, everybody, be as brief as possible at this point. No
I'll try to be
statements.
about 1 or a minute or so. The questions about compiling and collaborating research on empathy and a way to humanize one another and understand each other, along with the actual project of getting people to talk to each other across moral and tribal lines, specifically on issues that seem to be dominated or monopolized by ideology and polarization between the right and the left. So just 2 examples. The Black Lives Matter and police, that's one immensely important area where science has taken a back seat. The issue of student activism on campus, Muslims and communities, these are issues where science tends to be subject to kind of a conversational apartheid where ideology and dogma and polarization dominates the conversation and science sort of sits in the back. And I think so I guess the question is there, and there is a lot of people talking about this project to make this happen, even here in New York. Is this something people are talking about where the high level research and the books and the explanations of this kind of moral empathy and understanding at the high level then can meet, where the rubber can meet the road on the ground and actually engineer these conversations on the ground level? And then no long answer needed, but I mean, in short, is that something that people have ever been talking about, and would that be something that could conceivably be possible through campuses as well as through relationship building with communities, police, things like that? So that's all.
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what you're discussing and what a lot of the people in the audience have been discussing. I think your concern is sociological, and a lot of people are bringing up individual examples, like a psychopath would be an individual example. So I think what you're discussing is a group of people, ideological group or nation state, and its citizens extending moral empathy to other people. And I can't help but think of Freud and the concept of projection. And that essentially the reason why it is, not the reason, but a potential reason why it's so overwhelmingly difficult to extend moral imagination to a group of people you find to be diametrically opposed to you ideologically, even if it's not a zero-sum game, is because you need a group of people to act as a scapegoat to pin some type of negative impulse, negative belief you have on that other person. When I was an undergrad and I was strictly more liberal person, I found myself engaging in moral imagination. I was particularly concerned with the question of why conservatives hated gay marriage so much. And I found that it's kind of this discursive performance that liberals give. They say, oh, I don't understand conservatives, I don't understand conservatives, to the point that if you even simply attempt to understand someone who believes something differently than you, then it becomes, you become suspect. You know, as you say, that explanation becomes conflated with excusing them. So I can't help but think of projection as a potential explanation for why people refuse to extend moral imagination.
very briefly, just to add on some points that other people have raised. Originally, you did start out talking, you, Robert, about what is the root of all badness, right? What is the root of human evil? And because there's supposed to be a spirituality element to that. And I wanted to ask whether or not you think maybe now that some of what you pointed out, this failure of moral imagination, is due to the fact that, of course, you're weird, and most of us here are weird, white, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic, right? And this David Foster Wallace, for example, in This Is Water, makes a very similar point where he says the failure of moral imagination is a great tragedy of kind of Western civilization, but he's talking about what goes on in a shopping line. You're talking about global geopolitics and kind of the spiritual root. And I want to ask you whether or not, if you use this moral imagination, would you think that someone, say, who was tortured to death in Saddam Hussein's acid pits would have a very different conception of what evil is than you do, and someone who was in Auschwitz might have a very different conception? And because we've never experienced that, but we have experienced these daily failures of moral imagination, we place so much weight on that as a moral truth rather than maybe something that's actually there.
Okay. Okay, this, I guess. Okay, if you're both quick, we could do both of these and like really pithy.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any examples of people who have seriously lost out or been disadvantaged because they had too much moral imagination or cognitive imagination. Just an example of someone who's been a loser because of that.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to kind of ask about particularly Paul, what he thought the value of, or imagination of reason was in this kind of, as opposed to empathy, or a tremendous capacity to reason as a species, as a way to combat evil. I was reminded of Jonathan Glover's wonderful book, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, but I won't go into that. But he had perfect examples like the Massacre of My Lai, or Malay, I don't know how to pronounce it, where certain... Anyway, I just wanted to maybe truncate that question and talk about our capacity for reason as a response to evil in the world.
Okay, so should I start?
Yeah.
Or so, at least in responding to some of these things. First question, if the question is, am I aware of some science that, if brought to bear on these issues, would transform them, I'm not aware of specific kind of findings or whole theories or anything that I haven't brought up. I mean, I've kind of conveyed what I think can be helpful in situations like this, is if there's an earnest effort on both sides to understand the perspective of the other. On the question of Freud and projection, I don't know. I'm not especially drawn to Freud. I think there's a certain amount there, and I've written that. But some of the things you're talking about, I would just have other explanations for. I mean, it being hard to apply moral imagination to your opponents, that I would explain that in the terms I've already explained it. I recognize what you're saying about, if you start defending conservatives among liberals, you're in trouble. And I mean, I think that's almost a candidate for biggest source of badness in the world, precisely because that human tendency, again, to equate explaining with absolving impedes so much kind of rational analysis. On the question of whether my perspective is that of the white industrialized, what does the whole acronym stand for? I'm sure the answer is yes, whatever it is. Weird, yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, from the point of view of somebody tortured to death Saddam Hussein, the optimal thing would be to remove Saddam Hussein from power. There are definitely those kinds of conflicts of perspective. I tend to be a utilitarian. That is to say, however hard it is, kind of add up, try to figure out what is best for humanity overall. And inevitably, there are some people who you know, whatever solution you propose, there tend to be some people who come out on the bad end. So, you know, it's certainly a valid perspective of someone suffering to want the suffering to end. And there's certainly a downside to leaving Saddam Hussein in power or leaving Assad in power or whatever. It's just that if we could have avoided the whole Syria thing in that example, for Assad to still be in power would surely be better than several 100,000 people dead, several million refugees, and a whole wave of fear, you know, emanating through the world. I would think. So I don't invalidate those perspectives. I would just try to approach things from, you know, a kind of a universal perspective, and you can't serve everyone's interests at once. And I think the final question was kind of directed at you. Oh, are there examples of people? Oh, I'm sure you could come up with them. Nothing springs to mind, but again, you know, that's life. It's a complicated world. Of course, you can say, well, I think I understand your perspective better, sir. Why don't we talk? And the guy kills you. You know, that can happen. That can happen. There is, you know, there is such a thing. Although often in these cases, there was actually not good moral imagination exercise. I mean, the famous example of counterproductive appeasement is Chamberlain and Hitler. Well, I guess in retrospect, Chamberlain didn't get it right. He didn't, you know, successfully peer into Hitler's mind and figure out what was going on. So I wouldn't call that a case of kind of successful perspective taking. That was successful in the technical sense of accurately gauging what's going on in the person's head, and then it failing nonetheless. Although I'm sure that could happen.
So I won't do point by point. I think Bob really covered these things nicely. I will say I'm very much of a champion of reason in its role, and I have a book coming out on it, which is somewhat critical of empathy, because the title is Against Empathy. So that's anyway. Now you don't need to read the book. But I did want to speak to one point, which actually goes back to what you were saying before about Saddam Hussein's victims, and connects to your thoughtful remark earlier, which is, and I'm not sure whether there's a tension between the two of us, but I totally agree in the power of moral imagination. Better to be smart than to be dumb, better to get in people's heads than not to, for all the reasons laid out. But I wouldn't want to think that went in hand with giving up on moral discourse about good and evil, or moral condemnation, and so on. I think maybe this is controversial, maybe not, but I think there's extremely valuable purposes in thinking about some things as right and some things as wrong, and getting people's emotions built up around that. So forget about geopolitics, for instance. One change which happened in my lifetime is people look at sexual harassment in a very different way. It used to be boys will be boys, it's just fun, no big deal, and now it's something you'd be ashamed of. If I was accused of sexual harassment, I'd be ashamed, it'd be horrible. Or of racism, I'd be ashamed of it. And in some way, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to view, although we should look at people who do sexual harassment, we should look at racists, figure out what's going on in their heads, show a moral imagination towards them, but we should still say, yeah, but you shouldn't do that, that's wrong. And I wouldn't want to lose moral discourse in the heat of all of this.
Okay, but surely, and we can end with a question for you, I guess. I'm in charge. We're going to end with a question for you.
Okay.
Surely, if you think empathy can frequently misfire and do harm, and I'd be curious, by the way, if you agree with me that often what the problem is the natural, easy deployment of empathy, right? If you agree that it's doing with empathy what people naturally do with it, you know, within the tribe and so on, that is, by your evaluation, often the problem. But anyway, surely if you think that empathy can often misfire, then you must think that, you know, gathering emotion around notions of right and wrong can equally misfire. I mean, bad people always think they're doing the good thing, and they're pretty riled up about it often, right? I mean, ISIS is sure they're doing the good thing. They're full of moral indignation. And it seems to me that, you know, in principle, moral imagination can sometimes dampen undue moral imagination, and that's one of its virtues. But anyway, I give you the last word.
I agree with both points. I think that my case against empathy is a sort of natural deployment. It's the way empathy works is that I favor my family over strangers, I favor one over many, I favor people who look like me, I favor the attractive over the ugly, and so on. And I think this distorts things terribly. Empathy can be used and exploited in ways, the Donald Trump example comes to mind, which I think have bad ends. But mostly I agree with that. I also agree that moralization is an incredibly dangerous thing and has all sorts of risks. I think it's indispensable. I don't think we'll have a good world, even a utilitarian good world, without talk of good and evil and condemnation. But it could certainly be misused. In fact, when other theorists say, what is the core fact about evil that makes evil evil? One candidate explanation is moralization. So people have argued, there was a book out by Alan Fisk and a colleague, Pinkers argued this thing that if you took all the people killed by predation and violence and loss of control, that'd be a much smaller group than the number of people killed in the course of people who genuinely felt what they were doing was the right thing.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all again for coming. Again, I'll be doing another talk a week from tonight, and I just want to close by especially thanking Paul for traveling all this way to give me so much trouble. Thank you.
Thank you.